All right, welcome to part 3. So I want to begin, as always, by saying first that all copyrighted materials are here quoted for the purpose of commentary, criticism, and education on matters of public interest and are therefore covered under the Fair Use Doctrine. I also want to clarify, as I always do, that this video series is in absolutely no way, shape, or form an endorsement of any kind of white supremacy or pro-white racism or racism of any kind. I do think that racism is an important topic to address and one that needs to be discussed. I simply think that Rob and DiAngelo is going about it the wrong way. Without further ado, let's continue. Okay, so here we are back for part 3 of our deconstruction of White Fragility by Rob and DiAngelo. To begin with some dissenting comments, I have more from Ken Corprew, who I have a feeling is going to be our loyal opposition in all of this. But anyway, he says, and by the way, what queued him up to this video, the existence of this video series, was he was on another one of my videos saying there's so much white fragility in the comments here. And it's like, Ken, that's the same thing I keep talking about. Everything, you look at everything everybody said and dismiss it wholeheartedly, just completely throw it all out on the basis of it being white fragility. All you've done here is given yourself a mechanism by which you get to diffuse any responsibility for engaging with the opposition to your viewpoint. You just dismiss it all as being white fragility, and that's it. And so he says, you stated that it's not just white people who are having a problem with DiAngelo's book. If so, name one person of color who is not on Fox News who is having a problem with the book, White Fragility. Where is your data to back this claim? Okay, well, you know full well that nobody's conducted a study, a formal study, to say whether or not black people en masse are disagreeing with white fragility. However, what I was actually referring to more than anything else was that I know the ethnicity of a number of the longtime commenters in my videos, and I know which of my regular viewers are black that are coming out and disagreeing with this. To those viewers, if you want to identify yourselves to them, that would be fine. But the other thing I want to take opposition to is the idea that it hasn't been on Fox News. That's what really pisses me off. The idea, so I think I can safely extrapolate from that if what you're saying is that if they've been on Fox News, then they're shills in some way or something like that. The fact that they may have spoken on Fox News does not diminish the validity of what they've said, and it does not diminish the sincerity of what they've said. And this is, you want to talk about racism, you want to talk about racist assumptions, you want to talk about deeply ingrained, socially ingrained racism. How about the thing that the left keeps pushing out, that any black person that doesn't agree with them is just on the take from white conservatives, as if to suggest that we just have these, that black people are just some kind of tool that are being used by white media interests, and they actually seem to think that blacks are incapable of arriving at this on their own or something. Anyway, but moving forward, he says, it's interesting how in your previous video you basically stated that Dr. DiAngelo's book... Okay, stop emphasizing the doctor thing. It doesn't matter that she's a doctor. As other people have been pointing out, you can get doctorates in just about anything now. The fact that she is a doctor does not advance the sorry, pathetic, wholly, academically, intellectually, philosophically, and logically worthless premise that she is pushing here. Anyway, it's interesting how in your previous video you basically stated that Dr. DiAngelo's book was inherently true. No, I didn't, and I defy you to show me where I said that. So if her basic premise is true, then you obviously are having a problem with how the message is delivered. No, I have a problem with the premise not being true, and how it's delivered, but at the core, the fact that it's not true. Dr. DiAngelo addresses that in her book. White fragility isn't the inability to agree with Dr. DiAngelo, it's the inability to talk about white supremacy without getting angry, crying, or displaying some other childlike emotion. So, just like Dr. DiAngelo stated, if whites cannot talk about white supremacy without getting all butthurt because the truth is being told, then we will get nowhere. Okay. First of all, I'm sure you probably think that I'm sure that the way I'm talking right now sounds like white fragility to you. Longtime viewers of this channel will tell you this is how I talk about everything, every single topic, even stuff that I'm excited and happy and enthused about. But no, your entire premise is wrong there, because I don't think that it's inherently true. I think there is exactly zero inherent truth in this book, and I will go so far as to say I do not think blacks are oppressed in this country, systemically oppressed in this country, just like I don't think women are systemically oppressed in this country. And what's funny to me is when you say something like that, now we live in a culture where if you say that, people will accuse you of being the oppressor. You need to, and to that end, you need to really look into what it means to oppress somebody. People who are trying to oppress you want you to know damn sure that they are oppressing you. It's not this subtle academic nonsense. You know, look throughout history, whether it's Hitler, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, Idi Amin, Stalin, Mussolini, North Korea, any Saddam Hussein, any dictator throughout history. Have we ever needed a liberal studies department at some university to explain to us that this was an evil, oppressive regime? No, it's bleedingly obvious. Anyway, so the thing is, so I know by sounding vehement, by sounding passionate about it, you probably think that this is white fragility. This is me trying to get my point across. I don't have any trouble or any hesitation talking about these topics. Generally, I find that if I put forward my disagreement, it's other people who get angry and pissed off about it. So I don't know if that's, I would never sink so low as to call that black fragility, but there's some kind of, in my experience, it's the people on the far left who fly off the handle and can't talk about these things. They're the ones who get quote-unquote triggered. And since you don't know me, Ken, I identify as a left-leaning libertarian. I live the life of a social liberal. I just can't identify with the insane fuckwits on the left now. Anyway, so hopefully, maybe that's cleared some stuff up. Anyway, today we're going to get into Chapter 2 of the book. DiAngelo tries to... she tries to make the argument that science has... I'll play the clip for you, but it's rather bizarre. She tries to make the argument that science has attacked black people in some way or something. Anyway, she's going to make the case, the basic premise she argues that that race does not exist, that race is a social construct the same way that... race is a social construct the same way gender is a social construct. Well, I don't believe gender is a social construct, but we'll deal with that shit some other time. That idea can be easily refuted on the whole, which is simply to say, she's trying to argue that race is a social construct. Well, if race is a social construct, she doesn't have a position. If race is a social construct, how did people come to the conclusion that they wanted to benefit white people to the detriment of black people and all across the board, back and forth? Simply put, yes, there are group identifiers that we use to identify different races. She uses them herself in this book, so it's kind of a bizarre claim. Maybe if I were to try to meet her halfway on this, maybe what she means is that people, the staunchly white supremacist, brazenly white supremacist people who try to make arguments for plus or minus degrees of quality based on inherent race and traits inherited through race. Maybe that's the argument she's trying to put down. I don't know. She does a very poor argument of it, a very poor job of it. Anyway, I want to get more to the specifics of things that she actually says.
Chapter 2. Racism and White Supremacy. Many of us have been taught to believe that there are distinct biological and genetic differences between races. This biology accounts for visual differences such as skin color, hair texture, and eye shape, and traits that we believe we see such as sexuality, athleticism, or mathematical ability.
So I was curious what she meant about the statement of sexuality or perceiving sexuality. I'm not entirely sure what this means. Maybe it'll come up later in the text and I've forgotten about it. But I think what she's referring to is there is a long-standing stereotype that darker ethnicities are seen as somehow more inherently sexual or sexually outgoing than whites are. And that's actually, I wouldn't call that a biological thing or a racial thing or anything like that. That's more of just a cultural thing in regards to white people being more, generally working off of a more strict Puritanism in their behavior and everything. They're far more, have been far more culturally motivated by puritanical religious mores than these other groups. And I'm certainly not advancing that as a positive thing at all. I think, I believe it was H.L. Mencken who said that Puritanism is the sinking feeling that somebody somewhere is having a good time. So that's something that I think was arrived at much, maybe a perspective that arose out of European or at least puritanical colonialist sexual repression. I don't know that that's something that's necessarily perceived in other groups per se. That's just my dissent on the matter. So what she's going to get into next, I'll save us some time here. What she's going to get into next is to talk about how there was throughout U.S. history, up until a certain point, there was this ongoing historical push by various races to be legally regarded as white. And so what happened was different ethnicities or representatives of different ethnicities would sue in court on the basis of various scientific findings and sue for the right to be legally defined as white. And so she uses, for example, the Armenians, an Armenian interest group sued for the right to be defined as white and then became legally defined as white and that sort of thing. And this is one of those things where it's like, you just have to stop and say, that's not how we do things anymore. When was the last time anybody sued the government for the right to be identified as white? The simple answer is they don't do that anymore because they don't have to, because we have moved forward on the idea that civil rights applying all across the racial spectrum is a fundamentally good thing. And this is the flaw in Robin DiAngelo's argumentation style. She presents these racist things that have happened throughout history and acts as if because this happened, this racist thing happened, therefore it's defining the country, when in reality it's like, no, we don't do that anymore. That practice is long gone, as it should be. So it's a very strange thing, and it's a recurring theme that we see throughout the book, which is she will argue that it's kind of like her big gripe with history was that things did not get perfect right away. It's not just that we she's not just satisfied with us moving forward towards fundamental equality for all races before the bar of law. She's not satisfied with the social progress and the legal progress and the political progress that we make. She's mad because it didn't all happen at once. It's kind of like she makes the argument that black women didn't have the right to vote until 1964, which is actually incorrect. All black women and everybody else got the right, was secured the right to vote with the Voting Rights Act in the 1920s. It's just that there were all of these barriers that were put up that were then later barriers that were put up at the state level and the like that were then struck down with that act. But fundamentally, they did get the right to vote at that time, along with everybody else. And but anyway, she acts as, okay, there was this problem, a legitimate problem that had to be taken care of, which was blacks being, people coming up with all of this ridiculous chicanery to deny blacks the rights to vote. So we took care of that problem. Now, I know you can say that there are issues, modern day issues, such as voter ID laws on the table that are potentially racist. I don't view that as racist. I think if you have the ability to get an ID to drive a car or buy liquor or anything else like that, you can get an ID to vote. That's not an endorsement of that of voter IDs, by the way. There could be all kinds of other problems with it. I don't view them as racist. But anyway, the issue though, the idea, it's like, okay, we dealt with the issue. It didn't get perfect right away, so we had to keep dealing with the issue over time, and it's gotten better over time. And she's mad that things didn't get perfect right away. I mean, things progress slowly over time. You don't just... It's not possible to just automatically make everything perfect, for the simple reason being that back when these laws were enacted, they thought they were making the necessary adjustments completely and in their totality. And we advance, we 100 or so years later look back at different points in history and look at how backwards they were, but not realizing that what they were doing at the time was important and was revolutionary, and they did not have the foresight to know about the unforeseen consequences of the little steps forward, and they didn't realize that there were more steps forward that they still needed to take. There will always, I think, hopefully, I think there would be some agreement here that there will always continue to be little steps forward that we need to take, but that doesn't mean that we are fundamentally on the right track. If we are taking those steps, it means we are on the right track. So again, I don't have any respect for or regard for the idea that we should view America as oppressive because it didn't get perfect right away.
Because, regardless of their ethnic identities, these immigrants were perceived to be white and thus could belong. Race is a social construction, and thus who is included in the category of white changes over time. As the Italian-American man from my workshop noted, European ethnic groups such as the Irish, Italian, and Polish were excluded in the past. But where they may have been originally divided in terms of origin, European immigrants became racially united through assimilation. 10. This process of assimilation, speaking English, eating American foods, discarding customs that set them apart, reified the perception of American as white. Racial identification in the larger society plays a fundamental role in identity development, in how we see ourselves. If we look white, we are treated as white in society at large. For example, people of Southern European heritage, such as Spanish or Portuguese, or from the former Soviet Union, especially if they are new immigrants or were raised by immigrants, are likely to have a stronger sense of ethnic identity than will someone of the same ethnicity whose ancestors have been here for generations. Yet although their internal identity may be different, if they pass as white, they will still have a white experience externally if they look white. The default assumption will be that they are white and thus they will be responded to as white. The incongruity between their internal ethnic identity, for example, Portuguese, Spanish, and external racial experience, white, would provide a more complex or nuanced sense of identity than that of someone who doesn't have a strong ethnic identity. However, they are still granted white status and the advantages that come with that status. Today, these advantages are de facto rather than de jure, but are nonetheless powerful in shaping our daily lives. It is on each of us who passes white to identify how these advantages shape us, not to deny them whole scale. Because race is a product of social forces, it has also manifested itself along class lines. Poor and working class people were not always perceived as fully white.
Okay, so this is incredible. So you remember she was talking about passing earlier. Now she's trying to make the argument that white does not actually exist. It's just a culturally advantaged classification that people try to pass themselves off as. So that's really incredible. Whiteness is something, I'll skip, I'll skip mocking it. I think we can see how ridiculous and backwards it sounds. But what she's going to try to do going forward is to shoehorn some fairly standard far left arguments about economic disparities and income inequality and all that, try to shoehorn all of that into this argument about quote unquote whiteness. And so she actually says those of us who pass as white, so white people don't actually exist. It's just something that where we've had our perceptions manipulated to mean for that to mean something. I can put that to sleep very quickly with the observation that transracialism is not a thing. That's one of my. I have a list of questions that no one's ever able to answer, and one of those questions is, if you can choose your gender, why can't you choose your race? And for those of you who are just tuning in, I have no problem with trans people. It's the 72 other genders I have a problem with. But anyway, that fundamental question resonates with me. And the thing is, there's no tolerance for it. There's no tolerance for somebody wanting to pass as anything but. Socially, there's no tolerance for anyone that tries to pass as anything but the race that they were born with. Rachel Dolezal being a prime example. If race is a social construct and it's something that we can use our connections to aspire into, then by that logic, Rachel Dolezal would not have done anything wrong. And if you're not checking in, or if you're just checking into all of this, Rachel Dolezal was a representative for the NAACP that was outed by journalists as actually being a white woman that was basically putting on blackface every day of her life and pretending to be black. And the way she was outed, the journalist that outed her just said, "These are your parents. They're white." And she's, your biological parents, and they're white. And she's like, "Well, I'm not going to comment on that, all that." And she's eventually outed as just being a blue-eyed, blonde-haired white woman that has been disguising herself as black every day of her life. And if this were true, sociologically true, then we would have somehow been able, progressive voices would have somehow been able to make a case to say that, oh, there is no, there would be a concept for being transracial, but there's not. There's not. We know what these ethnicities are, and it's okay for different ethnicities to exist and for us to know that they exist. There's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing. And the point is that we all that everybody have equal rights before the bar of law, and that their ethnicity not be a factor or not be something that is factored into our judgment of them. That's what it means to make progress. Now, the other thing I want to talk about, though, is the larger idea that of United States cultural assimilation. So she wants to make the argument that the standards by which we predicate our culture in the United States are inherently white, or some sort of imposition of white morality or something like that. I want to give you an example, and you tell me where the fault in my logic is here. I have an aunt who lives out in Texas. She is a retired school teacher. And she, grade school teacher, and when she taught high school, early high school, I believe, but I know it was in the upper echelons. I don't know the exact number, but it was in the upper echelons. But anyway, I know she taught high school, but anyway, she would have, because of Texas, there would be these young men that would come over, these boys that would come over with their dads from Central Arabic countries, so from Saudi Arabia and that sort of thing, heavy oil manufacturers, obviously. They would be coming over with their dads because their dads were there to do business. And these would be kids with a heavily, I guess orthodox would be the word, Muslim background. And she said those boys were impossible to teach. Because, and by the way, I'm not saying boys to demean them. I'm saying boys because they were children under the age of 18, and I'm an adult. Anyway, but she said those boys were impossible to teach because she was a woman. So they did not believe that they had to listen to anything she had to say. So if she gave them an assignment, they wouldn't do it. And it's not like they were thinking, a woman is telling us to do this, let us ignore it. It was not even getting on the radar at all. Like their cultural background was that, women were literally background, so they were not, it would not occur to them to even listen to what she was saying. So they wouldn't take, they would not take instruction from her. They would not do their assignments, anything like that. Okay. So, what is the correct way to handle that situation? Because at some point now, the thing is, I know that Robin DiAngelo probably has some superficial bullshit about how, we have to actively engage with the proactive systemic intersectionality of the non-binary, socio-politically bifurcated something or other, whatever. I know you've got some shimmering expression, but the thing is, at the end of the day, those boys are behaving in a manner that is fundamentally unacceptable to how we do things in this country, irrespective of their ethnicity. A black teacher, an Asian teacher, a Hispanic teacher that's female would have exactly the same experience. I don't know, maybe the ethnicity would make a difference with them, I don't know. But a female teacher of any ethnicity is going to have the same experience. And after a point, you just have to say, look, that is not how we do business in this country. That is not our culture. You will treat this woman with respect. I don't care what your culture over there is. You're doing it our way now. Or do we just respect their wonderful culture and let them act like assholes in class and never do any assignments? They just don't have to do any assignments because we have to respect their culture. No, that's bullshit. The human rights that we want to observe, that we want to strengthen and enforce and commend, are things that transcend ethnicity. And we know that those things transcend ethnicity because I think everybody here hearing this discussion agrees that slavery is wrong. And guess what? There are parts of Africa, some of them the parts that sold African slaves to the U.S. that are still practicing slavery to this day. And I think we all agree that that's wrong. Or maybe slavery somehow becomes okay because black people are doing it to other black. Is that what you're trying to get at? I mean, that's the thing. That's how ridiculous this gets at. I'll give you another example. I saw a documentary one time about a tribe in the Peruvian jungle that has a regular practice of taking 10-year-old boys and burying them alive as human sacrifices. The Peruvian government will not get involved because they don't want to interfere with an indigenous culture. Okay, I have no problem with your cultural practices right up until it gets to the point where you get a magical pass on violating the laws that the rest of us agree to live by. Here's another example coming from a religious example: the practice of Hasidic rabbis using their lips to seal the wound on an infant circumcision patient. Okay, literally they use their lips to seal the wound, and there's been a huge problem, by the way, of passing herpes off to children this way. But in any other circumstance in society, putting an infant's dick in your mouth is an instant go-to-jail offense, except in this case. So that's where we run up against a problem. We are forced to we come up to the question of, are we going to allow this because we respect other cultures, or do we have something better here? Is it better to not allow adults to perform sodomy on children? Is it better to not bury children alive? Is it better for all of the children to take part in the lesson and not be given a special pass because of their national origin? No one wants to tackle those questions. And I'll tell you this right now. I used to live in Mississippi, and it's also, I've also been in situations where I've been told that I should be tolerant of redneck asshole whites that want to drop N-bombs everywhere because they come from some less culturally enlightened background in that regard. The standards that we want to observe transcend any kind of ethnicity or cultural origin or anything like that.
Because race is a product of social forces, it has also manifested itself along class lines. Poor and working class people were not always perceived as fully white. 11. In a society that grants fewer opportunities to those not seen as white, economic and racial forces are inseparable. However, poor and working class whites were eventually granted full entry into whiteness as a way to exploit labor. If poor whites were focused on feeling superior to those below them in status, they were less focused on those above. The poor and working classes, if united across race, could be a powerful force.
Okay, so what she gets into here, I don't have, being that this is the audiobook, I don't have access to the citations, but others have told me that the actual citations are few and far between. That said, she doesn't offer a whole lot in the way of any actual historicity to support this belief. It's just, again, what I was talking about earlier of trying to shoehorn far-left economics into the white racial divide. Now, fundamentally, the reason I remain unshaken on this point, or at least indifferent to this argument, is because, like I keep saying, no one has, again, you talk about the questions I can't get answers to, no one has ever been able to explain Atlanta to me. I live in the Atlanta area. I have seen black prosperity in the extreme. There is not an issue with redlining here, at least not one predicated on black ethnicity, because we can, we can go to very affluent suburbs, gated suburbs that are entirely black. I can take you downtown to the business district and show you businesses and major business executives all the way to the top that are black, and black people who live in extraordinary affluence and abundance. And by the way, this I thought this was a good thing. I thought this was what we were working for. But it seems like we just can't acknowledge Atlanta, because if we did, it would kind of undercut this bullshit notion she's got that it's that ethnicity or that racism is tied to racial economic stratification that's intentionally imposed on blacks. It really, I mean, the city of Atlanta really and truly refutes this bullshit notion, and no one can explain it to me. No one can, in this country that's supposedly so racist and so completely prejudiced. It's not just a few. She likes to refer in the book to a few blacks that may have done well, or a few blacks that have done well. No, it's not a few. We're talking lots and lots. I mean, define numbers here, because I can definitely put you in at least the hundreds of thousands if you'll come down, if not millions, if you'll come down and check out Atlanta. And yes, there's black poverty and white poverty. There's all range of poverty, but there are a lot of blacks that are doing extraordinarily well in this town. So please, explain Atlanta to me.
But racial divisions have served to keep them from organizing against the owning class who profits from their labor. 12 Still, although working-class whites experience classism, they aren't also experiencing racism. I grew up in poverty and felt a deep sense of shame about being poor. But I also always knew that I was white, and that it was better to be white.
Robin, so your initial thesis statement in this book was that white people grow up detached from any kind of ethnic identity, and as such always think of ethnicity as something happening to other people, but don't view themselves that way. And yet here you are admitting later in the book that you always grew up knowing that you were white and that it was somehow preferable to be white. So which is it, Robin?
Racism. To understand racism, we need to first distinguish it from mere prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is prejudgment about another person based on the social groups to which that person belongs. Prejudice consists of thoughts and feelings, including stereotypes, attitudes, and generalizations that are based on little or no experience and then are projected onto everyone from that group. Our prejudices tend to be shared because we swim in the same cultural water and absorb the same messages. All humans have prejudice, we cannot avoid it. If I am aware that a social group exists, I will have gained information about that group from the society around me. This information helps me make sense of the group from my cultural framework. People who claim not to be prejudiced are demonstrating a profound lack of self-awareness.
So here we find ourselves coming to the brass tacks of Robin DiAngelo, once again demanding that you either admit that you have prejudice or you don't. And it's interesting what she's doing here, because you have to, by her logic, you have to admit that you have prejudice before you can come to understand the larger sociological structures, which is curious to me that there is an admission of guilt on your part that you have to make before you can apparently understand the logic of her underlying arguments. Now, one of the things that we'll get into more and more as we go on in this is the concept of knee-jerk reactions to things and that sort of thing. And for now, all I want to get into is the idea that, yes, prejudice is something that's hardwired into all of us as part of our survival mechanism. It's something that we share with lower animals. Just like, I have, I have encountered animals that love me the minute they see me. I encounter animals that are terrified the minute they see me. And yet, on the basis of nothing that has to do with anything I've done to them, they just have an ingrained automatic response to people who look like me, people who are my size, that sort of thing. They have these blunt automatic prejudices. What separates us from lower animals is that we are not motivated entirely by those prejudices as a survival mechanism. We have the ability to stop and think about our actions, just like we are not motivated exclusively by our base sexual urges or by our base dietary desires. We can stop and say, what do I want? What's the best course of action here? What's most logically and reasonably sound? We have this ability, and that is what sets us apart. And the real answer is, the real observation is, be open to any prejudices, or be open to realizing your prejudices when they occur, and take the necessary steps to dismiss them, to think beyond them, to overcome them. This is something that you have to do within yourself. But instead, for Robin DiAngelo, who is indoctrinating you into the cult here, It is admitting your guilt is the first step of admission into the club of the enlightened.
Scholar Marilyn Fry uses the metaphor of a birdcage to describe the interlocking forces of oppression. 16. If you stand close to a birdcage and press your face against the wires, your perception of the bars will disappear and you will have an almost unobstructed view of the bird. If you turn your head to examine one wire of the cage closely, you will not be able to see the other wires. If your understanding of the cage is based on this myopic view, you may not understand why the bird doesn't just go around the single wire and fly away. You might even assume that the bird-like torch chose its place in the cage. But if you stepped back and took a wider view, you would begin to see that the wires come together in an interlocking pattern, a pattern that works to hold the bird firmly in place. It now becomes clear that a network of systematically related barriers surrounds the bird. Taken individually, none of these barriers would be that difficult for the bird to get around, but because they interlock with each other, they thoroughly restrict the bird. While some birds may escape from the cage, most will not. And certainly those that do escape will have to navigate many barriers that birds outside the cage do not. The birdcage metaphor helps us understand why racism can be so hard to see and recognize. We have a limited view. Without recognizing how our position in relation to the bird defines how much of the cage we can see.
So the reason this birdcage metaphor doesn't work is because we have, in the case of the birdcage, we have something that we can step back, fully understand, and figure out. We can figure out how to open the cage. We can figure out how to dismantle it. The complete and total mechanism that is imprisoning the bird can be encapsulated and can be understood. Now, in the issue of racism, we have a wholly separate problem, which is the accusation from DiAngelo that we are incapable of fully encompassing and fully understanding the problem, that we can't figure it out, that we de facto as white people cannot understand. And that's why I reject the notion when I hear from people tell me you can't understand the problem because you're white. I reject that completely, because if the problem is impossible to understand, then the problem is impossible to solve. And what's interesting is DiAngelo goes back and forth throughout the book. She pivots back and forth on something. On the one hand, she wants whites to use their privilege and their authority and their abilities and their connections and everything to elevate and bestow all the rights and equalities possible upon blacks and people of color. Okay, so she wants that, but then every time that happens, she turns around and recontextualizes it as an extension of white supremacy. That every time whites do something to benefit blacks, they're not doing it to benefit the blacks, they're doing it to extend their own white supremacy, with no solution provided to how we get around this problem. This is something that we'll discuss when she talks about Black History Month, and it's something that we'll discuss again when she talks about the movie The Blind Side. So those are a couple of things to put a pin in for down the road. But the simple answer is, when you keep coming back to you can't understand the problem because you're white, you can't understand it, you'll never understand it, well, at that point, if I am wholly and completely outside any kind of ability to understand, then there's nothing I can do to solve the problem. And so to solve the problem means to understand it. And so that is, that's why this birdcage analogy doesn't work, because we're not talking about a finite concept that can be easily understood and remedied. That, I think, to portray the issue of racism that way would probably work against the larger point that she wants to make, that it's something that we don't understand and we're never capable of understanding, and it's going to, she put it, take a lifetime of work and a lifetime of education to figure out something that we ultimately, or try to get an understanding of something that we ultimately will never be able to comprehend. So that's the issue here. When you bring it right down to it, and this is a perfect place to stop for today, when you come right down to it, this new far-left social justice thing that has taken over in race relations comes down to a matter of, if you say, okay, what's the solution? That's insulting. You are now insulting blacks, or you're insulting whoever the highlighted group is in the SJW, the SJW focus is whoever they are for the current situation, you are now insulting them. That's an affront to them. How dare you try to solve the problem? You can't solve the problem. There is no solution to the problem. You just have to try to acknowledge your guilt in causing a problem with no solution. And so that is just simply a limbic cycle that I refuse to get into. If this is a problem, I want to know what the solution is. I want to talk about solutions. I want to get all the solutions on my desk, and let's figure out the best one and solve the damn problem. But you can't. This whole thing is structured so that you fundamentally cannot, you are always stuck at the point of you can't understand because you're white. And if I can't, if I can't understand because I'm white, then there's no way whatever solution is ultimately implemented is not one that I can go along with in good faith, because apparently it's something I'm not capable of understanding. And what it always keeps coming back to, and this is something I want to talk about in a completely separate video, but what it always comes back to is far leftists trying to shoehorn Marxist and socialist economic policies into some kind of dialogue about race relations. And at the end of the day, and indeed, the Black Lives Matter organization has stated that they are avowed Marxists. And at the end of the day, I'm sorry, I'm not going to get on board with Marxism. We're not doing it. Marxism has failed everywhere it's been tried. It has resulted in the deaths of untold millions of people. Actually, it is told. We know how many people have died as a result of it. It has ruined people's lives and killed millions and millions of people all over the world, and for some reason the left remains staunchly committed to the idea that this is what's best for everybody, and now they're trying to shoehorn it into race relations because they figured out that they can get what they want if they just they can finally get what they want because they've got something. They've got the accusation of racism is finally a social and cultural force so strong that they will intimidate enough people into silence that they can get what they want. But I am sorry, but if you cannot tell that the living conditions, even for the most impoverished Americans, are fundamentally better than the living conditions in the Soviet Union or in Maoist China or anywhere else where Marx's ideas have been put into place, then you really need to, as you put it, take a step back from the bars and see the whole thing.